All right. Okay. We'll figure that out. Thank you for. All right. No. We are looking at Jesus' words, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And this is one of those statements that we've heard, and we don't have the context around it necessarily to feel the full meaning of what Jesus is saying. And so, for those of you that have these little things here, I want you to turn, if you like these sorts of things, turn to John chapter 8, which is on page 101 in the New Testament passage. And you might see, it's on page 101, but it begins on page 100. And you might see that on chapter 8, there's a section called The Woman Caught in Adultery, and there's some kind of bracket right there. You see that? Verse 53, there's a little bracket. And then if you go down the column, and just before it says Jesus is the light of the world, there's another bracket. And the reason for that is that some scholars think this story was kind of shoved in there, and it doesn't quite sound right according to the timeline of all the other stuff that's going on. And the reason for that, is I don't know. People write stuff, and there's thousands of years of how this came to be. But the idea is that in verse 52, he's talking about searching, you'll see no prophet has arisen from Galilee. That's the comments of the Pharisees. And before then, it's talking about the rivers of life that I talked about 2 weeks ago. And Jesus is clearly in the midst of celebration of the Sukkot, of this Feast of Tabernacles. And it's joyous, and it's exciting, and it's lovely. And there's this huge celebration that I had to write it down because I don't remember how it's pronounced. It is pronounced the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, which is the celebration of the drawing of water. And we talked about that 2 weeks ago. It is a big parade. It's a big celebration. And then it just seems weird that the Jewish leaders would bring a woman caught in adultery. It seems like it's sort of, what's going on? But the question that, I'm going to nerd out on you a little bit. Because when we start in verse 12, it doesn't quite line up. Because it says, again, Jesus spoke to them. Was that continuing the conversation before the woman who caught in adultery or not? And it's just a little confusing. But it doesn't really matter. Because the context is this huge party. And if Jesus was saying, I am the light of the world on the last day of Sukkot, of the Feast of the Tabernacles, then there's context there, and it's really meaningful, and we'll share that in just a second. But if Jesus say it was the next day, guess what? There's another celebration, a whole nother holiday the next day. Because that day, as some rabbis said, God spent the week with us all throughout the Festival of Tabernacles. And he invites us to spend one more day with him. And that was the celebration. I wrote it down so I didn't have to forget how to pronounce it. That is the Shemina Atzeret, which means the 8th day stop. And there's some Old Testament reasons for that. But that's a day where you can celebrate all the fun stuff you had at Sukkot, but you didn't have to do all the prayers and the other things. It's just fun. This is a big holiday, a huge holiday. So there's me nerding out. But we're going to watch a video, and it has 3 depictions of celebrations. And they are all in the mind, I'm imagining, they're all kind of the same sort of vibrancy and excitement. Not yet. It's Excuse me. But if you could figure it out, it should be pretty clear. One of them is the Super Bowl. One of them is the Festival of Booths, the last night of Sukkot. And then that last one, I think, is New Year's. So you'll see. Let's see if we can, and even if there's no sound, we can still see it. Can you guess which one that is? There you go. So that's Super Bowl. So all of those celebrations. The first one was the Super Bowl, right? The second one was the Tabernacle Festival of Tabernacles. And the third one was New Year's in Paris. They were all pretty similar, sort of, right? Crowds, lights, dancing, sound. Sure, the Super Bowl in Philly celebration, that was pretty big. And we had kind of this neighborhood celebration of Sukkot, but it's the same kind of vibe. Because frankly, it is kind of the end of the year. It is New Year's. That 8th day after the Sukkot, that's the first official day of the rainy season in the Mediterranean area. This is, wow, it's going to be a new day. And if you've ever lived in a desert area, when it stops being 110 at 2 in the morning and starts cooling off, oh man, that's beautiful. That's a wonderful thing. That's what we're celebrating. There's so many feelings here. One of the things, and I really want to try to get at what it means to celebrate Sukkot, because it gets to why and what Jesus is talking about when he says, I am the light of the world, and all this argument that Jesus has with the Pharisees. Because some of it's like, this is so cut and dry. Why are we arguing about this, people? Who are you? Why are you? And like, well, everybody know, the Pharisees know who he is, but he's talking theologically about his Father, and there's this legal, anyways. Has anyone ever seen the movie Willow? Anybody? Yeah. Remember Willow? Yeah. Anybody? Willow? Have you seen Willow? Okay. Steven Spielberg, was it late 80s, right? Yeah, that's where I stopped watching movies. There is this scene where it's a really dark kids movie in the 80s. For those of you who grew up in the 80s, we had dark kids movies. But there's this scene where it's the good guys are battling the bad guys, and the good guys have surrounded the bad guy castle. And the bad guy happens to be this really powerful sorceress. And she begins to turn everybody of the good guys into pigs. Just turning everybody, transfiguring them into pigs. And there's this move where the one hero goes in, Willow, he goes into a tent, and he starts chanting this protection spell. And he's got, it's all fantasy. He's got a little wand, it starts to glow, and he's chanting this spell while there's utter chaos all around the camp. Everybody's being turned into pigs. And he's chanting this spell. And there's a desperation of trying to create an aura of safety in this tent while the whole world goes nuts. I'll tell you another story. I was reading about a rabbi who in 1973 was in Morocco. Now, I wasn't around in 1973, but those of you who were, you remember the Yom Kippur War? Remember that? It was a war in the Middle East. Wars are bad. But in this particular case, it was anybody who was Arab, anybody who was Muslim was having a major problem with anybody who was Jewish. And so here is the rabbi in his apartment in Morocco, which happens to be a Muslim country, and he is trying to celebrate the last night of Sukkot. And he's on his balcony with a few friends while everyone else in the streets are chanting death to Israel. There's a little bit of tension in the air. And he is sitting in his booth, singing the night away in joy. But he has to sing it very, very quietly because someone else might find out and they might act violently against him. And he recalls that, and now being in the United States and being free to celebrate freely and openly is a big difference. But the strain of joy, knowledge of God's providence in whatever the circumstance, is quite something. But it's even different than that. Because part of this celebration has massive messianic overtones. And what I mean is, it's about the Messiah coming back. It's about the reestablishment of God in the world, of the nation of Israel, and not just the nation of Israel, but all these good things that the God being in the world and working in the country and working with people, it is shalom. Everything is working right, and there's hope for a future. That's a lot of complicated emotions. And one last little nerdy thing. There's a story in Samuel where David, who is out, this is his bandit era, he's out there and he's trying to survive being chased by King Saul, and he says to one of his men, "Oh, I'm thirsty. Oh, I wish I could have some water from the well at the gates of Bethlehem." And so one of his men go down and take that water from the well, and he brings it to him in his helmet. And David says, "I can't drink this water. This is holy. This has been made sacred by the danger you had to go through to get that water." And he, as a kid, I was like, "What? You poured it out?" But he poured it out as an offering. And there's a connection here because, as I was saying, this celebration of the drawing of water, this is a huge parade because it's about 600 meters. There's a spring down the road. It's about 600 meters, and they draw water out of the spring, and then they parade it up the hill to the altar. And there was lights, and there was singing, and there was dancing, kind of like the Super Bowl parade. Holy cow. They pour water on the altar, and they pour wine on the altar. Does that remind you, O Christians, of something? Sacrificial altar, water, and wine. What do we, every month we celebrate wine. Right. When Jesus was pierced with a spear, water and blood came out. There is powerful symbolism here. Now, there's one other thing, which is really interesting, is that part of this celebration of drawing of the water is lights. They light the place up. They have candles. They have torches. They have. I read somewhere that in one of the histories that some of the priests, I guess, they learned how to juggle, and they juggled torches. They didn't teach me that in seminary. Sorry, don't know how to do that. But it was fun. It was performative. It was this huge, free, no holds barred celebration. And they'd light up Jerusalem. They'd light up the temple like it was day. And here we're talking about God providing for us, keeping us, but also this great hope that God is going to come again and make it right. And not just okay, but right, just, full of peace and goodness. And let alone, this is not just for us. This is for the whole world. This is a huge celebration. And Jesus stands, and it says at the end of our reading here, right in the middle, it says, Jesus was teaching in the treasury of the temple. And of course, the treasury, those are treasure boxes where people drop their offering. And it's right there next to the door in this place called the court of the women. And that's what they lit up with all sorts of candelabras and fire. So Jesus, in the midst of all this, says, I am the light of the world. Do you get it? Do you start seeing? When John says, and they don't understand, you begin to think that maybe it's not just because they're dumb, or maybe it's not because they just don't get it. It's because they don't want to. Jesus is being pretty clear. I am the light of the world. I am the one who's coming to bring light into the world, to overcome the darkness, to make all things right. And all of the arguments that he have that we could spend the next 40 minutes parsing through, I'm sure, all relate to, no, you're not the Messiah. Yes, I am. Really, I am. I am he. And to wrap this up a little bit, I want to ask you what this has meaning to us. What does it mean for us? And before we can answer that question a little bit, we need to ask, what does it mean to the people who believed and the people who didn't when Jesus first said it? Because it does say, he was saying these things. Many people believed in him. So he says very clearly, I am the light of the world. I am the one who's coming and has come. And people said, in the midst of this huge celebration, with all this meaning floating around as thick as molasses, they believe. Yeah, okay, he's the one. He's the Messiah. All right, we're ready to go. The kingdom of God is coming into this world now. And they believe. But it's clear there's other people who don't. Why do people believe? Because they sense that need. It's dark, and we need light, and we want a Messiah, and they're convinced and they're willing to believe and follow. And then there's others who don't. And I can only imagine it's because they're the ones who do want light. But you know what's funny about light? Once it's out, you can't really control it very well. I mean, maybe lasers, but not a flashlight. If you were, as a little kid, reading books underneath your covers with a flashlight, yeah, we can see that. It's hard to contain light. And I wonder if some of that for the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders was, wait, we need to control this. We need to somehow monetize it. We need to lock it down so that we can be very sure that whoever gets this light deserves it or is working for us. How can you do that? If you have light in the darkness, it is for anyone who is in the darkness, willing to turn and look at the light. So if you are noticing the darkness in the world, remember Jesus is the light of the world. And anyone who follows Jesus doesn't have to walk in darkness, but in light. But maybe you're thinking, this is kind of weird. Consider the nature of light. It goes where it goes. It fills the darkness, and the darkness is cast out. But whatever's found in the darkness, we have a Lord that loves. We have a Lord that forgives, and a Lord that calls, and a Lord that sends, and a Lord that wants to be with us, warts and all. There's some things I'd rather not have in the light in my life. But Jesus is already well aware of that. And just as silly as it is trying to capture light in your hands, so is it hanging on to my pride to think that Jesus doesn't already know and seen and forgiven. There is grace even there. So friends, Jesus is the light in the world. We do not have to walk in darkness. Thanks for listening, and God bless you.